Hi, I'm Chioma Dinso, CEO of Expertus. Welcome to today's episode. I'm going to be talking with you about everything you need to know about the GMAT, the real truth about the GMAT. And I'm going to be sharing with you my thoughts from an insider perspective. How do admissions people really think about the GMAT? So the first thing I want to share is that the GMAT is actually a lot more important than applicants think. I often hear applicants tell me that they know a friend or a friend of a friend who had a 550 GMAT or 5 something or 610 GMAT, and they got into a top 5 MBA program. So their assumption is that, look, they can apply with their 610 or 640 GMAT. The reality is that their friend or their friend of a friend who got in with a 550 or 610, that individual is actually an anomaly. The majority of the people who are getting in are scoring close to the average of what the schools report. So my advice to applicants really is that you should do everything in your power to make the GMAT a non-issue. If the GMAT is significantly low, it almost ensures that your application will be denied. There are exceptions, yes, absolutely. But for most people, though, whose GMAT scores are, in the 600 range, especially for the very selective schools, their admission will be rejected. The application will be rejected. The evidence of that, let me just share a Kaplan study that they've done over the years. And what Kaplan did was to survey admissions officers at business schools around the world, and what they found is that more than half of them said that the GMAT is a major factor in their making decisions in who to admit and who not to admit. So there's the proof. I encourage you to do everything in your power to make the GMAT a non-issue. Okay, so invest in the resources, take time to prepare. Don't just rush it. It's very important to give yourself the best shot at your MBA dream. And it's important that the GMAT doesn't end up being the deciding factor to your admission being rescinded. If you ask most admissions people, on the record, they will tell you that they look at everything holistically. Yes, they do. But the reality, though, is that there's more supply than the number of, there are more applicants than the number of seats available. So they have to make the tough decision to build a class. And if you don't have strong GMAT scores, it automatically makes it very easy for your application to start being pushed towards the rejection pile. That said, if you have extraordinary set of experiences and profile, then the GMAT may be sort of viewed as an outlier in the context of everything else in your application. But for most people, that's actually not the case. Most candidates that I see who have lower than average GMATs, they are not, the profile isn't so extraordinary that they can immediately overcome the low GMAT. So my advice to applicants really is that you do everything in your power to improve your GMAT score. Okay, I know there's another question that often comes out, which is should I take the GMAT or should I take the GRE? And the simple answer is it really depends. There are quite a few schools. Majority of the schools really accept GREs now, so it's an option for applicants. I think what you should do is consider whether you want to take both, actually, and see how you do. And if you perform significantly higher in your GRE, then by all means submit your GRE score. There are schools that make it easier for applicants by saying you can just submit either or. So Harvard recently made that decision. I think that was a really good decision on Harvard's part. I think that applicants should have the choice to submit the test that shows them in the best light. Having said that, that decision is not across the board for all MBA programs. There are still schools that would ask you to report all standardized tests that you've taken. And so you have to make that decision to determine which ones you want to, first of all, which schools you're applying to, what are the GRE, GMAT policies, and is it to your advantage, and then study for the test, maybe take practice tests to see which ones you tend to do well in, and then take that test. Okay, so that's that for GRE versus GMAT. One thing I wanted to touch on is, what is the GMAT benchmark, right? I mean, you take the test, you come out, you've got this test result. What do you do with it, right? What I would recommend is that you do two things. You first look at the average or the median scores that the schools report to see how your test score compares to that of the school you're targeting, or schools that you're targeting. That's the first thing. And the second thing is to actually look very closely at the breakdown of your test result. So the whole score matters, but equally important is the performance in each of the components. So if you have above 700 GMAT, that's great. However, if one part, so the verbal could be very, very low and your quant could be significantly high, or vice versa, you could have very, very strong verbal and very low quant score, that can be a problem. Okay, so it's ideal for the scores, the verbal and the quant, to be well balanced. Ideally, you want to have at least 80, 85 percentile in both of them. Higher is even better. Okay, there are people who have like 760, 770 GMAT and they're still trying to retake the test. I wouldn't bother. It becomes less about whether you have a 780 versus an 800. Schools don't really care about that. They want to know that you can handle the coursework. If you're not a native English speaker, they would scrutinize, obviously, your verbal. If you are coming from a non-traditional background or a non-quantitative background, they will scrutinize your quantitative score even more. But ideally, you want both verbal and the quant to be quite balanced and to be in the 80th percentile and above. The other thing I wanted to say is obviously the AWA and the IR. I think with the AWA, it's one of those things where if it's really low, it does raise an eyebrow, right? I mean, if you have a 2, it sort of raises questions. If you've got a 4.5 or 5, it's like it's neither here or there. You don't get bonus points for having very high AWA score. If you have a perfect number, that's great, but it's not about that. But if the score is low, it does raise some questions. Okay, the IR is obviously relatively new. Most schools are not using it. It will be interesting to keep an eye on that to see how schools are going to incorporate the IR in the future. I think that ideally you want your scores to be at least in the median in both the IR, AWA, and then the verbal and quant, so that it doesn't raise any question, and so you can move on and focus on other parts of the application, right? So the question obviously is, should you retake it? Let's say you take the GMAT and your score is, let's say, a 690. My question always to applicants is, if you've got a 690, it was your first time taking it, you've got a bit of time before the deadlines, and you think that you could potentially move the score to like a 720, 730, I absolutely recommend that you do that, that you retake. There are individuals that have a 690, for instance, and it's only 4 weeks before deadline. They have to make a decision between working on incredibly strong essays versus retaking the GMAT. Sometimes they have to make that tough call and go with the 690 that they have, as long as everything else in their story is very strong. So it's on a case-by-case basis. There isn't a blanket response to exactly what the perfect score is. There are people who take a GMAT and they don't score well. I mean, that's something you actually want to, they retake it and they don't do as well. That's something you want to watch out for as well. And what I've seen with applicants is that, let's say they take a GMAT and let's say they've gotten like a 600 or something, or 650, and then they retake it, and their quant goes up and their verbal comes down significantly. They actually could find that their score has dipped significantly, even up down to in the 500 range. That's a major deal. So it's very, very important that when you're studying to raise a component, so the verbal, for example, in your GMAT, then make sure that your quant doesn't dip. Or when you're studying to improve your quant score, make sure that your verbal doesn't dip. So that at the minimum it stays steady, and then the area of weakness actually goes up to see a higher score ultimately. Okay. The other thing I wanted to talk about is so what do you do now? You know, many of you are in the midst of the application process. You're trying to make a decision. Do you apply in a later round to buy yourself a little bit more time to take the GMAT? It really depends on what score you have and also your GPA. You know, if your GPA is off the charts, let's say you have a 3.8, you have an engineering degree or a very sort of rigorous undergraduate degree, and you've got a 710 in your GMAT, and you know that if you retake it, you could get a 730, you know, then you have to make a decision. I mean, how important is it to you to apply now? I mean, if everything is ready, you have your recommendation letters all set, you have great essays, then you know what? You might want to decide that you want to go for it and apply. For some people, though, they know that they've been testing and they've been scoring in the 750, 760 range, and they believe that they can get that kind of a score. And currently, their score is at a 700. It might be to your advantage to wait and retake it, get that 750 score, and apply round 2. This is obviously on the early side of things when you're looking at round 1 or round 2. If it means pushing it off to round 3, I wouldn't go for round 3 just because the number of spots that are available shrink significantly. So the ideal scenario really is if you're going to be applying in a year or a couple of years' time, definitely focus now on the GMAT or the GRE. Do a practice test to see how you're doing, and then take time to study for it, so that ideally you take it once, and if you're not happy with your score, that you have more than enough time to retake it. So that's it. It's something you want to watch out for. The GMAT is extremely important. Don't believe the hype that's out there. Do everything in your power to improve your GMAT score so you can give yourself your best shot at getting into a top business school. I wish you all the best as always. Let's talk, let's stay in touch. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, and I look forward to your questions. Have a great day.